Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I go over my round 7 game from the Luneberg Chess Festival. Now, if you followed the round 6 video, you know that I lost a tough game with black in the London system, an opening that I know pretty well, so it was a pretty big disappointment to lose that one. And as I've mentioned and alluded to in previous videos in this tournament, I really was not at my sharpest, but I was hoping to turn things around with the white pieces. Now, my opponent was a young German player by the name of Ashot Pavanyan, and he's just only 18 years old and has a rating around 2450, so I believe he's an IM and didn't have any GM norms to date, but obviously up and coming. And in this tournament, he'd actually started out really well. Now, the norm score for our group, I think, was 6.5 out of 9, and already by this point, I believe he was at 4.5 out of... I want to say 4.5 out of 6. So he was really in a pretty decent position with a win to actually get closer to that GM norm score. So I knew that he would be gunning for me in this game, particularly when I was the one that was struggling the most in the event. So anyways, I was going to try and hold the 4 with white, and yeah, let's see what happened. So anyways, Ashot, I played d4, and I knew that Ashot was more or less a King's Indian type of player. So I expected that, and he actually went knight f6. And then after knight f3, he actually went g6. And so I kind of knew not to expect a Grudenfeld here. He was probably going to go for his dynamic King's Indian setups with d6. And here I opted for the move g3. This move is maybe not the most ambitious line against King's Indian setups, but it is, quite positional in nature, and it's quite difficult for black to get like the seriously dynamic position that he wants, because white tries to typically play a controlled game in these lines. And actually, I employed this setup in round 1 in a game I did lose in this event, but it was not because of the opening, so I felt pretty good about this. So anyways, black played bishop g7, I went bishop g2, castles, and here d6 was played. And again, so far, nothing new under the sun. But at this moment, I played a move that's kind of unusual, and I played it in round 1, so maybe it didn't come as a huge surprise to my opponent, but it's pretty uncommon, and it's the move rook e1. Now, as I alluded in round 1 of this tournament, in that video, this rook e1 idea was actually inspired by a game that I saw the young Indian GM Pragnananda play against Grandmaster Murali Karthikeyan at the Extracon Open, the tournament where I actually got my second GM norm. The idea with rook e1 is that you're actually trying to play e4 and essentially transpose the lines to fianchetto perk type of variations without having played c4. And the point is that in many lines of the King's Indian, after the normal move c4, what winds up happening is there's knight bd7, knight c3, e5, e4, white takes the center with like this. And after this series of exchanges, there's an interesting position that comes on the board where white has more space in the middle with this almost Maroczy bind-like structure on c4 and e4. But interestingly enough, the bishop on g2 is actually kind of blocked on the diagonal because of its pawn, whereas the bishop on g7 that black has is actually very, very easily opened up towards the center and the queen side and can be extremely lethal on that diagonal. And so even though white has the space advantage, black has a lot of tricks tactically tied around taking advantage of the loose knight on d4, sometimes the whole diagonal. And this is what actually gives black this very, very interesting dynamic play, is the fact this bishop actually has, oops, that's a poor diagonal. I'll do that again. The bishop has this awesome scope on the h8, a1 diagonal, whereas the bishop on g2 does not. And so what winds up happening is that in the short term, black typically has a little bit of an initiative that white has to really do well to control, whereas in the long term, white has all of the trumps based upon the space. But again, it's a tricky position to navigate, and the merit of this rook e1 line is that with the rook on e1, the point is that if the move c5 is played, trying to open up the diagonal, now white is actually quite comfortable to take on c5 and actually go c3. And here the roles are a little bit reversed, where all of a sudden the white bishop on the diagonal is, unimpeded because the c-pawn has advanced one square too far, whereas the pawn on c3 actually restricts the bishop on the h8 a1 diagonal. So white, has a little bit of play here, and it's something that Pragg, really demonstrated quite nicely in his game against Murali Karthikeyan at the Extracon Open. So something that I had been thinking about, I was like, wow, that's an interesting idea. I think I should try it. And so this is my second game trotting it out. So anyways, after rook e1, my opponent actually went knight c6, and this was different than what I'd faced in round one. I believe my opponent went knight bd7 in round one, and we essentially had the reverse perk system that, or not the reverse perk, the fianchetto perk system that I mentioned was somewhat favorable to white because he didn't push the c-pawn. And this is actually quite a provocative move, knight c6, because basically it's inviting me to challenge the knight on c6 with this d5 move. But the question is, if I do nothing, he's probably going to play e5 anyway and kind of force open some play regardless. So the question here is, what should I do? Should I push forward or should I do something else? Now, one way, let's say I actually pushed forward, but let's say I didn't and played a move like e4. Well, here black would probably go e5, again trying to justify the knight on c6. And after d5, knight b8 is an option, and then I can play c4. And we really have an interesting position that's kind of just a fianchetto King's Indian, except that the center is closed. And it's really tough to say who this actually favors. Now, in many lines of the King's Indian, actually, in the bayonet attack, white is actually eager to play this type of system with the bishop on g2 and the knight on f3. And essentially the setup where, I'll back up just to illustrate, but there's a line in the bayonet attack where after g6, c4, bishop g7, knight c3, d6, e4. Bear with me for a moment, not queen e2, bishop e2. There's this line here, castles, knight c6, d5, knight e7, b4, and the bayonet attack where actually the move is actually knight h5 and then g3 is an option. And the point is that after f5, knight g5, knight f6, bishop f3, the bishop actually sits comfortably on g2, and the knight actually entertains jumps to e6. And this is an extremely complicated line, but I think one that is of interest, because what I was trying to figure out over the board was if I actually wound up playing the particular variation with knight c6 and e4, whether this type of setup would actually be very favorable to me or not. And because I already have this fianchetto here, which is nice, and my g3 pawn is restricting the knight from coming to f4, which is nice. But the difference here, though, with the c4 move is actually black gets to play a5 and establish this clamp on the queen side. And so I actually don't initiate this, pawn storm as quickly as I'd like. And when the knight comes to c5, it does an excellent job of contesting the pawn on e4 and essentially just, getting pretty adequate counterplay in the position. So I was really unsure how to judge this one, and it's quite a dynamic position. I think a really good winning attempt by Ashot, because basically there's no way I can really control the game as much as I'd like to, and I have to make really important critical decisions everywhere. Another thing with this closed center is that black can also go knight e7. And, of course, there's new implications here with the knight on e7. But I do think the knight is actually better placed just going back to b8 just to post up on these dark squares. So, So, anyways, that would be the implications of e4. But I actually went d5 and took up the challenge. And I must say, this knight c6 idea to provoke d5 is a theme that I'd actually seen in particular variations of the perk, where white is actually not fianchettoing at all. In fact, there are lines that Magnus Carlsen has played quite a bit in rapid with knight c6 and knight b8 back. And this is kind of what transpired in the game, because after knight b8, what black's plan is to undermine the pawn center, particularly with d5. And with the pawn d5, and typically c6 is an option, opening the center, or even playing e5 and playing for the closed center. And in a lot of circumstances, what winds up happening is that the position kind of transposes to a Sicilian defense, because the bishop again bears down on the diagonal, and a lot of times the c pawn, black c pawn, winds up getting traded for the white d pawn, and that's a feature, particularly exchange we see in the Sicilian. So, yeah, a lot of things to think about here. And again, after knight b8, I have another critical decision to make about which structure I want to go for. Do I want to go for e4 and take the space but kind of block out my bishop? Or do I want to go for c4 and go back to King's Indian specific lines, where basically my pawn's on c4 as opposed to staying on c2? So the question is, do I want e4 lines with the pawn on c2, or do I want c4 lines, d4 lines with the pawn on c4? I actually decided to play c4, and part of the reason I did this is just d4 lines I'm a little bit more familiar and comfortable with, obviously being predominantly d4 player. Again, e4 was an option, but in these particular positions, particularly when it's a closed center with e5 and knight c3, it's quite unclear whether it's so advantageous to have my pawn still stuck on c2, and it means that I really have to play with just my pieces, which can be somewhat of a challenge. So it did seem a little bit more natural to me to just advance the pawn to c4. So after c4, Ashot played e5, and this is actually quite an interesting try because he's basically saying, I'm comfortable going to the King's Indian proper lines, even though you've already established this fianchetto and have the pawns on c4 and d5, because my knight is coming to c5. And I, again, didn't fully appreciate this as a concept, and I, again, was not really too happy with the proceedings here. Now, again, white is not worse or anything here. I mean, white has space in the center. White's not poorly developed or anything. But it's just a really dynamic position that, is tough to judge. And here I have to make another decision about how to play. Do I want to play e4? Do I want to keep developing? What do I want to do? I played knight c3, not really committing to playing e4 myself yet because I wasn't sure whether I wanted to play e4 and lock down my fianchetto forever. And I figured that e4 for black is not a possibility just yet because I have knight g5, and all of a sudden I have 3 attackers on this pawn, so e4 is kind of out of the question. But actually a move that I kind of overlooked that was an option after e5 that maybe would have been a better choice just to try and get a controlled game is actually taking en passant with d takes e6. And the concept here is that if black plays bishop takes e6, I actually can play knight d4, and the point is that my knight is hitting the bishop on e6, and my bishop on g2 is simultaneously hitting the pawn on b7. So black is pretty much obliged to deal with those issues by playing bishop c8 as not to lose the bishop pair. And all of a sudden we have a fianchetto variation again, but I think this version might be, fairly decent for me, and at least it transposes back to a fianchetto variation that I know. Now, it's not one I was angling for, but I could go knight c3, rook e8, e4, knight bd7. And actually, I believe because of this bishop e6 to bishop c8 move, I'm actually a tempo up on typical lines. Because after I play a move like h3 here, I believe typically in this position, white's rook would still be on f1, and in this position, I think white's actually a tempo up on normal lines. And if that's actually the case, then obviously this position is fine for me and probably a little bit better than normal. So d takes e6 was a serious choice, and the thing is that f takes e6 is also an option, but it's kind of a little bit of an awkward one. I mean, just from the standpoint that now the e6 pawn might be a touch of a liability. These might even be deemed hanging pawns in the center. If the pawn advances to e5, then the bishop's diagonal is actually... Ooh, I'm really bad at drawing diagonals today. But the bishop's diagonal on the h8 to a1 diagonal will be a little bit suspect if the pawn comes to e5. And you can see my bishop on the long diagonals not particularly impeded. And so this actually would be kind of a nice position just structurally to play. So anyways, I went knight c3 and, eschewed that opportunity. Didn't really even strongly consider it, honestly. And after knight c3, black went a5. And we can already see here that, black is planning to anchor that knight on c5 and really not allow me the typical queenside pawn storm that white gets in these types of structures. I now went for the move e4, just kind of taking the center here. But I already felt that, Black was actually getting exactly what he wanted because he's getting this dynamic King's Indian position. It's not entirely clear why my rook is actually more effective on e1 than it is on f1, and I think that's another trade-off here is that I do have this fianchetto setup on the king side, but my rook f1 to e1 is not particularly useful here, and also, I did not manage the queenside pawn advance that you typically get in the structure. So those types of things actually kind of justify Black's setup completely because all of Black's moves have been really useful right to date. So after e4, Black went knight a6, and I went bishop e3, kind of dissuading knight c5 for now, because now I could take on c5, and that'd be kind of attractive. And after b6, I think that's a good move just in case if I take on c5, he can recapture with the b pawn. And then the e5 pawn isn't hanging, and, also he gets maybe the half-open b file. And now I went for the move queen c2, just reinforcing the e4 pawn, kind of preparing for knight c5. Another option would have been to play h3. The idea is that I discourage knight g4, and I actually prepare the move knight h2, which in some lines allows for knight g4, which might be desirable if they recapture on g4. I can play h6, g4, and get a further clamp on the f5 break, and also discourage the knight coming to h5, because if you go f5 with the knight on h5, you can't actually recapture with the pawn because the knight's hanging. So this was another option that maybe could have been considered. But quite frankly, I think in all these lines, the Black is actually totally fine. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about these positions is that if you analyze them with the computer, White seems to be better almost in every variation. But the computer doesn't quite understand or fully grasp the closed nature of the position and how things just light on fire after the move f5. And so White just sees the space in the center and says, oh, White's better. But that's not entirely the whole story. And that's also why it's incredibly difficult to judge these positions, because the computer is not an effective tool a lot of the times in these setups. And I think I heard Nakamura once say that, that what the King's Indian is one of the few openings where the computer's still kind of lagging behind the human understanding in some sense. And the reason for that is because it is a closed structure. I'm trying to think. The other opening where I believe this is still the case is actually the French defense, because the computer will seriously underrate a lot of lines of the French, particularly when there's these fixed centers where there's pawn storms on either side, and only properly evaluate the position when it's too late. And I think from a, essentially from a preparation perspective or just from a human player perspective, if you like original positions where, maybe you're not going to get out-prepared or outgunned by an engine, the French and the King's Indian are really good weapons that, kind of prevent the White player from, really hammering away at your lines in the same vein as other openings. So, yeah, they're risky, obviously. They're a little bit sharper than most. You're ceding a lot of space in both lines. But the French and the King's Indian are a good pair in that respect. So anyways, after queen c2, knight c5 was played. And now I actually went h3, just covering the g4 square now for knight g4s. But I also was not really seriously considering knight h2. So especially with the queen now having migrated from the d1 square, there's no justification for it. So I kind of missed the boat here. And now Black played bishop d7, and essentially the question for me in these structures is, what is my plan? Like, obviously, I need some type of plan to justify my setup and push forward, and it's just really difficult to judge what that is. Now, the reason bishop d7 was so important is because my initial plan was to go a3 and b4. So, as you can imagine, let's say if a move like bishop d7 wasn't played, and Black played a move like king h8. Well, now I go a3, trying to play b4, and if White went a4, Black went a4, I can actually take on c5 and take on a4. And even though this is still a little bit, risky, I'd say, just giving up the two bishops for the pawn, although White should be fast on the queen side. Here, White is up a pawn and, has some things under control. In the position in the game with bishop d7, now the move a3, which I actually wound up playing, actually is responded to with a4, and I'm actually not able to get this break. And so a3 is probably a slight mistake, but let's say I don't play a3 and play a move like b3. And then I slowly prepared with a3 and b4 here. Black is still very fast. And after b3, knight h5 could be played. If I go a3, f5 is already coming. And you can just see here that the position is kind of lit up in the center and the king side, whereas my modest b4 break has not even gotten off yet. And so it's just, again, very, very difficult to judge these positions well, and it makes them incredibly difficult to play because I have to worry about f takes e4, I have to worry about f4, I have to worry about takes on e4 and sometimes bishop f5. It's just a total mess. So anyways, after a3 and a4, I actually made a terrible, terrible decision here by playing the move bishop takes c5. And part of the reason I played bishop takes c5 is because I recognized that knight h5 and f5 was on the cards. So I thought that I should try and open up the a and the b file at all costs to get some counterplay on that flank. But giving up the bishop here is just too hasty a choice, and frankly, the counterplay that I was trying to get does not really make a whole lot of sense. The computer actually suggests king h2 as a move here, but again, I really don't buy a lot of the computer suggestions here because it just underestimates black's counterplay, and already I don't see how this deters knight h5 and f5 very much. I mean, you can argue my king's maybe in a slightly better position on h2, maybe it's overprotecting h3, but again, I don't see the counterplay here, and black is getting f5 in. So, again, the next series of moves are probably not very good on my part. Well, not probably. They definitely aren't good on my part. But they're connected to this plan of trying to open up the queen side at all costs. Even if I'm not winning a pawn here, I thought it was imperative to try and, begin the march of my a pawn. And at least I saw here that after bishop takes c5 and b takes c5, which was played, that I would have a passed a pawn after the move b3. So first, I actually played rook eb1, just so that when I played b3, I was keen on taking with the rook to try and get the b file going. And after queen c8 was played, this is actually a very, very effective move because it actually hits the h3 pawn with tempo and potentially shifts gears towards the queen side. I went king h2 to defend, and now queen a6 was played and hitting my c4 pawn. And now I played bishop f1, trying to cover up the c4 pawn, maybe introduce ideas of timely knight b5s, and also trying to play b3. Black now went bishop h6, and I think this is a really, really nice move, and also kind of highlights the counterplay that black has in this position, because this bishop h6 move, just taking over that diagonal, is actually extremely effective, and it just makes the bishop not particularly a bad piece, because if I don't open up the center with e takes f5, typically the bishop on g7 does struggle a little bit. But by putting the bishop on h6, he actually controls an important diagonal. He might, that bishop might contribute to the f4 being a move one day and playing on the dark squares. And it deters me from actually playing this knight g5 move, which is a typical theme when the f5 break comes, is I play knight g5 and then spin that knight over to e6, which, where it's anchored quite nicely. So really nice move, bishop h6. After bishop h6, I finally, liberated my b pawn and played b4. I thought this was the right way to play rather than b3, because here I think it kind of forces white to take, or black to take. If you kind of ignore it, then I'm going to play b takes c5 and knight takes c5 and converge in the center. So after b4, a takes b3 en passant was played, and I played rook takes b3, and this again was kind of the crux of my idea, to get counterplay on the a and b files with a4, maybe rook ab1, and try to get something going before f5 happened. But now after rook takes b3, black played knight h5, and you can see that f5 is pretty much imminent. It's a clear and present danger, as they say, and it's really difficult to kind of stop that move. So anyways, after knight h5, I played the move knight h4, trying to discourage the f5 break a little bit more, because at least here, maybe my knight's doing something on f5, or eyeing the f5 square. Maybe it's slowing down a touch. A slightly better move would actually have been knight b5, targeting the c7 pawn right away, and then also that forking the queen on a6 and a8. And then after knight b5, white would pretty much be would pretty much be forcing queen c8, and now I can go a4 and kind of press onward, because truth be told, the knight on h4 is not particularly effective at all, and yeah, this maybe would be a little bit faster, but black is still, for choice here, having the two bishops and, the more dynamic break. I mean, my a-pawn is trying to run up the board, trying to get play on the queen side, but black's f5 move is really going to result in a direct attack on my king. So you judge which one is more important. So anyways, I did go knight h5 at knight h4. After knight h4, black went queen c8 anyway, which is, quite smart, really, gunning up for this move f5. And now I went rook a b1, ditching the efforts to push the a-pawn so quickly and trying to potentially double rooks on the 7th. And black went queen d8, which is another excellent maneuvering move, because now it actually accentuates the fact that my knight on h4 is kind of vulnerable. In some lines, knight f4 might be an option because the knight on h4 is hanging, and if I take with the g-pawn. And it also just, is a nice creeping move that gets the queen over to the dark squares. After queen d8, I went bishop e2, directly eyeing this knight on h5. And now black actually went knight g7, which again is a pretty good move. Just moving the knight out of the way, not allowing me to play bishop takes h5. Now, one move that maybe would be kind of thematic in this position, you might say, why wasn't this done, would be the move knight f4. But I was kind of keen on seeing this move, not because I'd play g takes f4. That'd be a huge mistake, allowing this take capture with check and then queen takes h4 to follow. What I was keen on, if knight f4, was actually the move bishop g4. And I thought that the exchange of the light squared bishops would really be favorable to me, because it would kind of blunt the impact of the move f5. And actually, it actually is still kind of difficult to get off with, I'm having 4 pieces on that square. So f5 is actually not a thing just yet here. Whereas after knight g7, f5 is still very much on the table, because there are 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces supporting the f5 break. So after knight g7, I went for a4, just pushing my pawn further. At this point, I recognized that f5 was clear and present danger. I couldn't, really do anything to stop it. I mean, g4 doesn't help because my knight is hanging, and f5's coming. So I thought maybe my opponent would be distracted by my a-pawn and try to, take that one. But he was not, and he went for f5. And you can basically see here that I'm just not equipped to deal with this break, because first of all, my king on h2 is actually not supporting the f2 pawn, and all my pieces are on the queen side, and the action is now basically taking place in this radius over here. Let me draw the radius instead of squaring, highlighting all the squares. But basically, that's where all the actions is, and this is where all my pieces are on the queen side. So not so hot. I went bishop d3, trying to at least angle my pieces along at the f5 square and trying to keep the pressure that way. But now black played f4. And this again illustrates just how powerful his initiative is, that he can actually afford to cede the light squares because the dark squares are where the action is. And the bishop on h6 is perfectly placed on this diagonal. The bishop here is eyeing h3. The queen can leap into the game. The rooks is eyeing the f-file. It's just a decisive attack, and the position is actually just lost. So after f4, I tried to put up my best fight, and part of it was going to be predicated around the time situation. I was playing relatively quickly because I recognized that I was seriously worse, and so that was kind of my hope, was to kind of play on the time a bit, and then hope that that would kind of, essentially change the game for me. So after f4, I played bishop f1 very quickly, trying to reinforce the h3 pawn. And note that my queen on c2 is, for the moment, covering the f2 pawn in that square, so the rook can't just come down and win it for free. But now after bishop f1, black played knight h5 back. And the difference here is that now knight h5 eyes g3 and basically creates very, very dangerous tactical threats. And again, my pieces are far away from the action. After knight h5, I went knight g2, moving the knight away, in part because if I do basically a nothing move on the queen side, let's say like rook b2, the threat is f g3, f g3, and knight g3. And the issue here is that if I take, then, bishop f4 check, the king moves, and then queen takes h4, and it's just completely decisive. So I thought I had to move my knight out the way, and that's what I did. But after knight g2, black played fg3, and actually went knight g3 anyway, and the position is just crushing in black's favor. Now, taking on g3 was actually quite unnecessary. Black could have played a move like queen g5, or maybe even rook f3. There were other ideas in the position, but my opponent tried to, the brute force method, if you will, the brick method, as I like to call it, trying to just whack me over the head with a brick and end the game. And I was actually quite excited to see this, not because I thought that, my position was so great, but really because I thought this actually meant that he'd have to, actually finish the game quickly, because if he didn't, I am a piece up for the moment, and that might, stir things up a little bit. So after knight takes g3, I quickly took on g3 with the king, and after queen g5 check, I scurried away with king h2, and I really was kind of wanting, black to kind of show me where the mate is, show me where your decisive attack is. Now, it doesn't mean it isn't there, but again, it at least, asks black some questions that he really has to answer under the gun, because I am a piece up now. So after king h2, black went rook f3, crashing down on the third rank, and the threats are immense. Like queen g3 check is a threat, rook takes h3 check is a threat, bishop takes h3 check, or bishop h3 is a threat, rook doubling the rooks with rook a f8 is also a serious threat. So the position is still kind of not great. But now I went knight e2, and for the moment I'm covering up those threats because my knight covers the g3 square, and the rook on b3 defends the h3 pawn horizontally. So, yeah, it's not, as easy as it looks. So after knight e2, black actually made a mistake here and gave me a window of opportunity. The position is lost, and why don't you actually pause the video and try to figure out here. This is a nice tactical exercise. Black to play and win. All right, I just took a sip of tea. Hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what the best way forward for black is in this position. It turns out that the best way forward is actually rook a f8. Just getting the last piece into the game and not, crashing in right away. And the point is I don't have any great way to consolidate because the bishop on f1 is actually hanging now because it only has one defender and it has no squares. And so after rook a f8, if I go a5, then rook takes f1, rook takes f1, rook takes, black has recovered his piece, and I can play knight g3 and try to hold on here with my knight shielding the king, but there's actually a funny line where now the rook just comes back to f8, and I have to just play rook a3 and try to push my a pawn, and it's actually kind of tricky, but the point is actually that after rook a8, a6, rook a7 is a hugely important move, not allowing my pawn to a7. And then the line actually goes queen b2. So I'm actually threatening queen b8, winning the rook. And now black has to go queen d8 to stop that threat. And now even here I have some tricks with the move queen b7. This is really remarkable stuff. But the point is that if the taking is just losing because I follow up with rook a8 and I do queen my pawn. So the move here after queen b7 is actually queen a8, trying to actually trade the queens off. And here I'm actually obliged to trade. And even with the pawn making it to a7, this position is actually completely winning because now the king actually can walk to the queen side and pick up the pawn. And these bishops are just too strong, and my knights can't support the pawn. So funny ending to this line is actually king f8, king e8, king d8, king c8, and king b7, and ultimately black will pick up the pawn and then make use of the fact that he's actually 2 pawns up with the 2 bishops, which is, just technically 1. And my knights don't have any kind of outpost to get into the game to try and, mix things up. So very, very interesting line. That's actually not so easy to see. I mean, rook a f8 is, I think, quite not so difficult to see. F1 is being hit. But I think actually this line where I just wind up pushing my pawn and the rook and the queen have to come back would be not the easiest line in the world to conjure up. So I think we can forgive him for not seeing this deeply, but he did open the door for me with the move bishop takes a4. And remarkably, in this position, I'm actually better with precise play. The best move in this position, and the move I actually did not play, is actually queen a2, and this is the move that would enable me to really, hold on and be slightly better according to the engines. It's still a tricky position, but the gist of it is that this bishop is pinned to the rook on a8, and so all of a sudden he can't bring the rook into f8 anymore, and I am still trying to trade this rook on f3. So after bishop b3, queen a8, rook f8, and queen c6, I'm actually getting into the position a little bit. The bishop on b3 still hit, and the line continues with my rook getting involved in the game as well. And a serious threat now is actually queen takes c7, and then queen h7, establishing a battery on the 7th rank, whereas black actually has no checks remarkably here because my knights actually cover the f4 square quite well, and my king is actually effectively shielded. So, yeah, the line continues: queen d8, rook c7, bishop e4, rook a7, queen f6, knight g3, bishop f4, and we get a complicated line essentially where the game continues and my king is still remarkably weak, but I am a piece up here and it's not lost, and that's, much better than I could say for the past, 5 to 10 moves. And really for the next, 5 to 10 moves. Because after the move bishop a4, I went rook b8 check. And unfortunately, this one does not get the job done. Because the issue is that after this king g7 move, which is extremely strong, my queen is still hit on c2. And there's also just a threat of black just taking on b8 and then taking the bishop on f1. So after king g7, I went queen b2 as to be able to recapture on b8 with my queen and support the bishop on f1 still. But after this particular version of the exchange, black now can go bishop d7, block out a check on c7, and entertain rook takes h3 as a threat. This was actually my last chance in the position to try and to get something here because I am still a piece up. I just don't have the same counterplay that I had on the other line. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out white's way forward. Okay, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out white's way forward in this one. The move is actually remarkably knight g1. And it's actually a move I saw in my calculations, but I just didn't go deep enough. And I think in part it was because I was actually afraid of some smothered mate in this scenario. I kind of got a little bit haunted and was worried about some rook h3 or queen g3 and rook takes h3 type of mate. But what I failed to notice or fully comprehend is that whenever there's a sack on h3 and I actually take the pawn with my knight on h3, I actually give a square to my king on g1. So I'm actually not getting kind of trapped or smothered mated on the h file because as soon as I take an h3, I have the g1 square, and that's pretty much why I didn't go for this. And it's actually a little bit embarrassing because clearly there's no smothered mate here if black doesn't have a knight and I can go to g1. So a little bit disappointing here, but it is what it is. But now, again, this position wouldn't be winning for me at all. It's still incredibly complicated, and the line that the computer gives is after knight g1 is queen g3, king h1, bishop d2. That's a tough move to see, I think. And now after queen d8 is actually better than queen takes c7 because if I go queen takes c7, rook f7 becomes a threat. And then after rook b7, king h6, and there's all types of stuff with bishop h3 and, again, threats towards the king here. And after queen d8, bishop g5 back, queen takes d7, there's this amazing position that arises now where I have a rook, a knight, a rook and two knights for the queen, and my king is kind of safe right now. My knight is controlling knights are controlling all the important entry squares to my king, but it's extremely complicated, and who knows who's going to win this game. But basically, queen d8's a little bit better, and the point is that after rook f7, now I go queen h4 and actually try to trade the queens. But even here, black being 2 pawns up with the 2 bishops means this is far from over, and I can really try to turtle and even trade the rooks. But even here, just with the 2 bishops, it's going to be a difficult position to win, and my knights are extremely clumsy right now. So that's part of why it makes it so difficult. But it would have been a nice way to stay in the game, basically with interest, with the ability to actually fight for a win. So instead of that knight g1 move, I actually played the move queen takes c7. And this is actually just decisive in black's favor, frankly, because basically, even though I've given my king the g1 square, and it appears that this pin should frustrate black, it just doesn't actually. And the point is that after rook takes h3, which was played, and king g1, black actually has the move queen g4. And this is a move that, frankly, I missed in my calculations and is just winning pretty much on the spot, because black defends the bishop on d7 and remarkably threatens bishop e3 mate, because the knight is pinned to the king on g1, and the rook, of course, is controlling the h-file. So what it means is that now my king actually needs to take a walk, because the bishop e3 check is an imminent threat, and there's no way I can actually block it. So I'm actually forced to go king f2, and now my king goes for a run with really, really clumsy minor pieces around it, and that just makes it, difficult to do anything. After king g1, black played bishop d2, another extremely strong move, but not super difficult to find, because you can see my king is trying to run away, and so he's just taking those squares away and reinforcing the mating ideas with rook f3 check now and bishop e3, forcing my king back to h1 where there'd be mate. So I went knight g1, trying to give my king a square and hitting the rook on h3. And now bishop e3 check was played, and again I have this problem where I'm on the run. I played knight takes e3 because if I go king e1, well, at the very least, he can just take on g1 and get a free piece. So I have to kind of take this one. But now queen g3 check is a move. And the point is he's recovering his piece with check, and my king still stays on the run after queen takes e3 check, king d1, queen d4 check, more effective checks, king e1, queen takes e4 check. And really I can resign here, but I did think there was a sliver of a chance based upon the fact that the d7 bishop is still hanging. So I thought that if he doesn't take things with check, I do have this opportunity to take on d7 with check and maybe even collect h3. So I still wanted him to show some technique before I resigned. So after queen takes e4, I went king d2 back, because you can't take on b1 just yet because I have threats of my own. But now he went for rook h2 check, which is a very nice move, just basically getting the rook to the second, basically forcing me to block with a piece because I can't go back to the first rank because of mate on c2. And if king d1, then there's mate on b1. So I have to block. I win bishop e2. And now queen takes d1 was finally played. And he had calculated here that I can take the bishop, but it's just one check. And with the king being so naked, the 2 pieces versus the rook really stand no chance. And so I did play queen takes d7 check, and after king h6, queen takes d6, at least trying to, manufacture a few more checks. But now black played queen b2 check, and I had to go back to d1, because if I go king d3, remarkably queen d4 is just mate. And same thing pretty much goes for king e3. Queen d4 check, king f1, queen f4 is mate again. So I had to go back to d1, and after queen d4 check, king c2, queen takes e4 check, again exploiting this pin of the bishop on e2, king d1, queen d4, king c2, and rook f2. Nice move, just preventing the queen f8 check move. And, again, he's taken so many pawns here, I can't seriously entertain anything. So I went queen e7, just trying to maybe entertain this pushing the d6 pawn, still keeping an eye on the h4 check as a possibility. Note that queen d5 would be a terrible blunder, because now I have queen h4 check picking off the rook on f2, and then all of a sudden it'd be white that's winning. So you can't take the d pawn just yet. But because he's taken my c4 and e4 pawns, now his own pawns become a factor. And the move c4 is a very effective one because now the c pawn in conjunction with the queen can create new threats. So after c4, I went d6, and then queen d3 check was played, which is a really, really nice move. Again, exploiting the fact that my bishop on e2 is pinned. And after king c1, queen a3 check was played, which is also a nice finesse because now, in conjunction with checking my king on c1, he actually prevents my d-pawn from moving to d7 because my queen on e7 is pinned. So after my move king d2, queen b4 check, king c2, and now c3, I don't have the privilege of pushing d7, and queen b2 check is an imminent threat. I went queen takes e5, just trying to collect another pawn and, again, try and entertain some checks here. But now after queen b2 check, I'm forced to come out to d3 because king d1 loses to queen d2 mate. And after king d3, queen d2 check, I actually resigned because now we have a situation where essentially I just can't hold everything together. If the king comes to c4, well, there's c2 and c1 queen with check is just going to be mate in a few moves. And unfortunately here, my queen has no checks. This black queen is, keeping everything under control, and the rook as well. So I have no checks to the black king on h6. And the other way, with king e4, just loses to rook takes c2. And the issue is here that, in this particular position, essentially, I'd be lucky if I got this position, but even here, there's queen e3 check at the end, and wherever my king goes, I'm going to lose the queen. If I go to f6, queen g5 picks up the queen, and if I go to d6, queen d4 just trades the queens, resulting in a 2 versus 0 pawn ending. So, essentially, once I calculated those lines and just saw that my king pretty much is doomed either way it goes, I resigned. Tough game to play and to lose. I really was kind of outplayed from the jump and did not understand the nature of the closed position that arose as well as my opponent did. And I think, in part it's because my opponent is a well-versed King's Indian player, and so the closed structures, he knows where his counterplay is coming from. But the other component is that I just did not get the right type of counterplay off in the position, which really kind of snowballed Black's initiative because I didn't really get anything going on the queen side in time. But again, that's kind of the tricky thing with the King's Indian a lot of times is that, in the closed structures, white is favored by the engines in almost every line. But, basically the longer that you run it, the more you understand that basically white's computer moves don't actually have a serious concrete plan, whereas black has this plan that's very, very dangerous. So when you're analyzing, particularly with the King's Indian, you have to be really, really judicious about what's good for you, what's not. And clearly, my preparation was not up to snuff in that respect. So it is what it is. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.